The image of the African-American railroad worker is a staple in the cultural history of America. The face of the black Pullman porter was in railroad advertising for years. The porter became a recognizable character in American art and music. And in the early days of Hollywood, black actors portraying train attendants and porters were one of the few images of African-Americans we ever saw in the movies. But the link between African-Americans and the growth of American railroads is much deeper than carrying luggage or preparing a sleeping car. In a new book that's lushly illustrated with many never-before-published photos, we learn about the extent of what railroads meant to black Americans in terms of employment, culture, travel, and civil rights. My guest is Theodore Kornweibel. He's SDSU Emeritus Professor of African American History. His book is called Railroads in the African American Experience, a Photographic Journey. And it's a pleasure to welcome you, Ted, to These Days.
Good to be here.
Now, we'd like to invite our audience to join the conversation. If you have a story about the African-American experience on American railroads, maybe you have a family memory or a personal story you'd like to share or a question, give us a call with your questions and comments. Our number is 1-888-895-5727. That's 1-888-895-KPBS. You know, just off the bat, Ted, I have to tell you, congratulations on this book. It's just really a remarkably beautiful book.
It is. It is. It should win a design award.
Yes, it actually should. In going through the book, I personally was surprised to learn that African Americans started their work on the railroads during slavery. Tell us how that came about.
The entire Southern railroad network that was built during the slavery era was built almost exclusively by slaves. Some of the railroads owned slaves. Other railroads hired or rented slaves from slave owners. And the most shocking thing that I found was that women, as well as men, were actually involved in the hard, dangerous, brutal work of railroad construction and continued to work for railroads after they were built in lesser roles. But in the construction phase, little difference between the abilities, considered abilities for black women. And white women would never have been considered for any of those jobs.
Now, one of the first stories you tell in this book is the story of Rose. She's a slave who belonged to the man who was contracted to build the Charleston and Savannah Railroad. Tell us about her. How did her life change when she was ordered to join this railroad effort?
Well, there's a fascinating series of letters from her owner to other individuals, and we can piece together Rose's story quite well through that. And she apparently had been a domestic servant living in a not a terribly wealthy, but an urban household in the more moderate climate parts of South Carolina.
Mm-hmm. And what year are we talking about?
Talking about the 1858, 59, shortly before the Civil War.
Right.
And she had been accustomed, actually, to domestic work, so she probably was a cook, because that's what she was later put to. She would have had kitchen utensils. She would have been able to go every morning to the daily market to pick up fresh produce and so forth, a garden perhaps. She was sent several hundred miles distant to the coastline, where this railroad was being built through swamps. It was a brutal building project that for miles and miles they had to actually build on pilings. There wasn't solid ground. And she found herself a cook with crude utensils, with just the bare flour, lard, bacon, molasses, cooking for a mixed group of enslaved black and some Irish railroad workers. The only woman there, isolated, vulnerable, and
completely out of her element.
Completely
yes.
Out of her element.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned something that I found extremely interesting, that these so-called hired slaves were working on the railroad side by side by laborers who were being paid for their work on the railroad. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. Both black free blacks as well as white workers. There were some categories of work in which both slaves and free persons worked, like brakemen, like firemen, stoking the firebox on a steam locomotive. Other jobs, like maintaining the track, were almost exclusively the province of black workers. And what's significant here is that the pattern set during slavery, what jobs blacks could and could not do, no, that's the wrong way of putting it, what blacks were allowed to do or not allowed to do, that then became the national pattern after the Civil War.
Oh, I see. I'm speaking with Ted Kornweibel. He is SDSU Emeritus Professor of African American History. He is also the author of a new book, Railroads in the African American Experience. And we are taking your calls at 1-888-895-5727. Ted, how did you find this out? Is there a lot of information about on slavery during the beginning of the railroad era?
Well, there's actually quite a bit of information. Much of it comes from the railroad's annual reports that were prepared for stockholders, because they would list the assets, they would list the expenses. So they would list the number of slaves who were in various categories, how much they had paid to rent them, or if they purchased them, what the value of those slaves were, if there were fatalities, what that was in the loss column. So the railroad's annual reports reveal a great deal.
Now, after the Civil War, when ex-slaves were paid workers for the railroad, as you say, some of the jobs stayed the same for a long time. But what was the attraction of the railroads for freed slaves?
That's a good question. The railroads were the best in the South, were the best alternative to escaping two worse fates. Either agriculture, which often meant sharecropping, which meant you were in debt year after year after year, or domestic service. The railroads were the most important industry that blacks ever worked in. Blacks worked more blacks were railroaders than were steel workers, were coal miners, were loggers. You pick the industry. That African Americans participated in railroading, and in a wide sense, more than any other industry. So this is the African American industrial experience.
Yes, I understand your point.
And for Southern blacks especially, to be able to get, it was low pay, but to get a steady job, steady income. There's a blues that says, when you marry a railroad man. Every day Sunday, $1 in your hand.
Now, I have to ask you, if I may, Ted, about the incredible amount of photographs and illustrations you have in your book, Railroads in the African American Experience. How did you compile these images? Where did you find them? Well,
one source was eBay.
Ah. So you just put out the call, huh?
Well, I didn't put out the call. I just combed for months and months. I just combed every day searching under railroads, blacks, African Americans, and I found some absolutely fantastic photographs. I shot them all through Photoshop to clean them up.
Sure.
But you'll find many never before seen, never before published photographs in this book.
You have African-American workers working on the tracks. You have them as porters. You have even photographs of African-American nannies on the train taking care of children while as part of their duties as being nannies to the children themselves.
Those were the Pullman Maids. And Pullman Maids only served at most half of the length of period that Pullman sleeping car porters did. But beginning in the early 1900s and the heyday being the luxury travel of the 1920s, only the most luxurious trains had Pullman Maids, and they assisted especially lady passengers or women with children. They were expected to be able to give manicures, to dress hair, assist ladies with the bath, assist with small children. Some of them were nurses and might be called upon for assistance like that. But some of the touching images are and they're posed images of these maids with white children and entertaining them and showing them the scenery and so forth.
And as you say, they are posed. How did you happen, Ted, to take on this project?
Well, I've been a lifelong rail fan. So railroads have always been fascinating to me. And about 18 years ago, I received a call from a railroad museum in Pennsylvania asking if I knew of anyone that they could bring in to give a talk on black railroaders. And I said, I didn't know, but I do some bibliographic search, see if there's somebody out there who could do that. And I turned up nothing. So I gave him a call and said, if you can stand an amateurish presentation with some slides copied from books, I'll do it for you. Uh-huh. And I did, and the response was very, very positive, that blacks in the audience, whites in the audience, everybody recognized that this was a buried history of railroad, a buried part of railroad history, that people knew about the Pullman porters and the dining car waiters, and that was it. There's so much more.
Now, you were a professor of African American Studies for many years at SDSU. Ted, you are not black, so how did that come about?
Well, I was involved in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and that gave me passion and principles that directed me towards that. But what really sealed my passion for African American history was my first teaching job, which was at a still segregated all-black state college in Texas, Prairie View A&M College. And I began to read in the library so that I could teach some black history to my students, and I got the bug.
And it hasn't left you, and it's ended up right now in this beautiful book. Let me go back to the experience that you're talking about, or African Americans in the railroads. As you say, it's not all Pullman porters. One of the most dangerous jobs on the railroad was that of brakeman. How were trains actually stopped before automatic air brakes?
Well, before automatic air brakes and before modern safety coupler knuckles, trains had to be stopped. Trains of any length had to be stopped by brakemen on individual cars, turning a brake wheel to engage the brakes when the car had slowed or it had gotten from the station and was starting up again. They had to manually turn that brake wheel the opposite direction. Now, a train out in the country in the middle of winter, you had to hop from top to top of freight cars and manually turn these brakes, then manually turn them off. It was extremely dangerous that brakemen fell off. They fell between cars and were crushed. It was the air brake was probably the single most important safety feature ever developed.
And those early brakemen, was that one of the jobs that African Americans were quote unquote allowed to do? In
the South, that was a job that was pretty much preferred for blacks. It was defined for many years as a black man's job. Now, when automatic couplers came in and air brakes, those jobs became more attractive to whites. And so at that point in history, early 20th century, whites began to push blacks out of those occupations.
Before we have to take a break, let me sneak in one call. We are taking your calls, 1-888-89.